Welcome back to the deep dive. Get ready, we're plunging into another stack of really fascinating insights today.
Yes, we've got a really rich set of notes this time, pulled from quite an insightful discussion, actually, featuring some truly seasoned voices on, well, a pretty critical topic.
That's right. So our mission today is to unpack what's genuinely keeping leaders, well, on the edge, when they sit around that boardroom table right now, and what that crucial space is evolving into.
Hmm.
We're going to try and guide you through the most important nuggets from this discussion. It covers quite a range, everything from surprisingly personal journeys into board service right up to those massive global disruptions we're all feeling.
Yeah, think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding the high-stakes world of the modern boardroom. We'll give you the vital context, some surprising details, and hopefully enough insight to make it stick.
Okay?
Let's jump right in.
All right, let's unpack this then. We're starting somewhere maybe a little unexpected. With the personal journeys people take to actually get onto a board.
Yeah.
It might seem basic, but understanding those diverse paths offers some fundamental lessons, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You know, the source material we looked at includes personal reflections that really highlight just how varied these routes can be, and often quite non-traditional.
Right.
It's rarely just a simple ladder you climb.
So tell me about the first story shared. What stood out about that person's path?
Okay, so this individual, they grew up city-born, raised by a single mother who demonstrated incredible hustle, apparently even traveled abroad just to source fabric to resell.
Wow.
Yeah. And they mentioned that their entry onto boards often came about because clients they worked with saw their competence. They saw how they operated firsthand.
Ah, so it wasn't about applying or interviewing in the usual sense, but more about a reputation built through just doing the work.
Precisely. Demonstrated capability was absolutely key. They also shared this fascinating moment being called unexpectedly for a Special Olympics board position.
Oh, okay.
Initially, they hesitated because, well, they weren't familiar with the organization. But after being sent information and reading about their mission focused on intellectual disabilities, it just deeply resonated. And that connection led to 9 years of service on that board.
That's a powerful example, isn't it? Mission aligning with personal values, opening a door you didn't expect. What about the next story? Sounds like a very different starting point.
Completely different, yeah. This panelist came from a rural village background. They described these significant daily walks to school, 4 miles, then later 6 miles.
Right.
And facing real challenges with, school fees and things like that.
Navigating those kinds of barriers from a young age,
Yeah,
that must shape your perspective, surely.
it surely does. They talked about entering university from this rural background, citing King's College Budo, which is a highly regarded school in Uganda, as part of their journey. And their career path was also unexpected. Initially wanted to pursue law,
Right.
but were put off by what they saw as like excessive memorization of cases, just cramming.
And they had a memorable first encounter with formal recruitment, didn't they?
Oh, yes. They described their first psychometric test during recruitment for the East African community, the regional economic bloc. This was while still a student. Found it quite strange.
Strange how.
Particularly a section asking them to match pictures of dogs and goats. Not exactly standard fare for a BCom student.
Definitely not in the BCom curriculum, I remember.
Yeah.
They also mentioned working during university.
Yes, taking advantage of the boom era, which was apparently a unique time when students received sort of free government money, helped support them.
Ah, okay.
Later, when they wrote to HR expressing interest in an MBA, they were advised to pursue ACCA instead, the professional accounting qualification. That really set their professional trajectory.
Right.
They even faced challenges finding their certificates for a job interview at CMA, likely the Capital Markets Authority, and get this interviewed by 13 people.
13 people. Wow. That sounds intense. These stories really highlight the twists and turns, don't they? What about the third panelist?
This panelist shared something very personal, a wish they had shown more appreciation for their mother when she was alive. It's quite poignant, isn't it? A reminder that our personal lives really ground our professional ones. And professionally, they strongly reinforce this idea that board positions are often secured not through typical interviews, but because people you know and respect know your capability.
So it's less about applying for a job opening and much more about cultivating that reputation over time, building trust.
Exactly. They spoke about feeling privileged to serve on a board, especially alongside highly respected figures like a senior counsel and a former Uganda Society president. And this privilege they felt necessitates actively cultivating and, importantly, investing in professional relationships.
Takes effort.
Requires significant effort and investment, yeah. Not just passive networking.
That makes total sense. Building that trust, demonstrating capability,
Yeah.
it all takes time. So building on these unique paths, what specific advice did the panelists offer for someone looking maybe to get on a board or even just advance professionally today?
Well, the advice seemed to converge on a few crucial themes, things like the indispensable power of relationships, the necessity of making your skills visible, and the commitment to continuous learning.
Okay, let's dig into that. The panelists who reflected on their mother stressed nurturing and investing in those professional relationships, right? The ones we just discussed. And also building solid character.
Hmm. And another powerful piece of advice was to actively seek out mentors, maybe one, two, or three individuals. The recommendation was literally to sit at their feet, learn from their experience.
Right.
Explicitly stating that trying to navigate some paths alone is just unnecessary and difficult. And they stressed finding mentors not just in your immediate field, but in diverse areas like technology or even sports, getting different perspectives.
And they specifically recommended a book, didn't they? Mastery by Robert Greene. How did they frame its relevance?
Yeah, they used it to break down the stages of professional development, the initial apprenticeship phase, then the creative active phase where you start experimenting, and ultimately mastery.
Okay.
The core takeaway here, they emphasized, is the critical importance of becoming a subject matter expert in something.
Yeah.
Anything, really, whether it's a traditional field or something that seems niche like fashion. They even acknowledged how young people today are boldly, sort of, carving out and attacking new spaces. That aligns with this idea of becoming an expert.
That's a great point, identifying your niche and really owning it. What was the third piece of advice?
It was about making your skills known. Don't be shy about it. Be transparent about what you can do and be accountable for your work. And crucially, they countered that old image of networking happening only on the golf course.
Right. The source suggested that real effective networking today happens through doing things, not just schmoozing.
Exactly. By engaging in voluntary work, speaking at public engagements, writing articles, participating in webinars, asking thoughtful questions. You demonstrate your capability and your character. That's how people notice your skills and potential. It's far more effective for board opportunities today than just, relying on old social connections.
So it's about building a reputation through action and contribution. That whole transition seems to reflect a bigger shift in the boardroom itself, doesn't it? You mentioned the sources looked at the past, present, and future of this space.
Yes, and drawing on a book mentioned in the discussion, Ringing the Bell by Dr. Martin Alike, we get this fascinating snapshot of the board of the past.
And it sounds like, well, a completely different world.
It truly does. It was characterized by incredibly long tenures. One example cited was 43 years.
43 years.
I know. And significant privileges.
Yeah.
First-class travel, even anecdotes of being met by a Rolls-Royce in London, and board members having the ability to borrow money from the very bank they were directing, just unthinkable under modern governance.
And the composition, very different too, I imagine.
Oh, heavily dominated by old men with gray hair. Very few women, virtually no young people, and primarily consisting of accountants and lawyers. Networking was largely confined to the same exclusive golf clubs.
With governance practices that sound equally dated, like minutes being finalized before the meeting even ended, or papers just being left behind.
Yeah, it paints a stark picture of a different era. The board of the present, as described in the source, is very much a mix. It's dynamic, undergoing significant change, a transition phase, really.
Which brings us to the board of the future. Based on the discussion, what are the key characteristics we can expect? What does that look like?
Well, while the future is inherently uncertain, the lessons from recent events, like the unexpectedly rapid development of the COVID vaccine, highlight the capacity for agility, right? So the future board will likely look fundamentally different.
More diverse, I imagine. That seems to be a recurring theme.
Much more. Diversity across skills, composition gender, geography, age, with a deliberate effort to include younger voices and professional background. Future board members will need to be digitally savvy.
Meaning?
They don't necessarily need to be the chief digital officer, but they must be comfortable and competent navigating the digital world. It's unavoidable.
And environmentally conscious, too. Things like using digital platforms instead of printing those massive board packs.
Exactly. And the culture will shift too. Boards will look for thought leadership, for the courage to challenge based on knowledge and insight, not just authority or position. Intellectual curiosity will be prized, that willingness to ask difficult questions and explore new ideas.
So, requiring strategic courage. Being able to push back on management and strategy when necessary. Maintaining a forward-looking, futuristic perspective. Actively trying to understand the unknown unknowns, as they say.
It's a highly demanding role. It requires continuous learning. The sources contrasted this with the past, where getting information meant, physically going to libraries or using encyclopedias. Today, the resources for staying updated are fast, but also constantly changing. You have to keep up.
So while the tools of the faces around the table are changing, some core principles remain absolutely non-negotiable.
Absolutely. Independence, integrity, and the ability to collaborate effectively, these are timeless, even as meetings increasingly shift to hybrid or virtual formats.
Right. That shift in meeting format was a huge change forced by recent events, wasn't it?
It really was. The discussion noted the move from almost entirely physical meetings to hybrid and virtual models. They cited a specific example of an East African bureau's hybrid AGM hundreds attended virtually, over 1,000 online. So a big question now is whether boards will revert fully to physical meetings, or if hybrid is pretty much here to stay.
And that change in format likely impacts how boards source members, too, moving away from those exclusive networks we talked about.
Precisely. The source was quite clear on this. Future board members won't primarily come from the golf course. The search will need to be much wider to achieve the necessary diversity of skills, of perspectives, of experiences.
Okay, so this evolution of the board isn't happening in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
It's being driven and challenged by some pretty powerful external forces. What are the major issues keeping boards on the edge right now, according to the sources?
Technology, unquestionably. It's one of the biggest drivers of both opportunity and, frankly, anxiety. The digital age is just characterized by the sheer velocity of change, isn't it? And the overwhelming volume of new products and services hitting the market constantly.
And the discussion sources specifically highlighted some of the more unsettling or creepy aspects of technology. Things from a Business Insider article they discussed.
Yes, things that definitely raise eyebrows and concerns, like the concept of social credit systems, this idea of profiling citizens based on their online behavior. They cited China's use of this for things like housing eligibility. It raises serious questions about privacy, about online responsibility.
That feels like a fundamental shift in the relationship between technology and society.
Yeah.
Really profound.
It does. Hacking was another major concern flagged. The source mentioned a JP Morgan study that broke down hacker types. Governments, about 10%. Hacktivists driven by causes like, say, child labor, maybe 20%. And then criminals, a massive 70%, who are purely after money.
And the criminals are the ones seen as most scary, right?
Yeah.
Targeting online financial transactions, stealing personal identity.
Exactly. Other unsettling tech examples included robots becoming increasingly human-like. There was a Boston Robotics example mentioned of a robot autonomously scanning a room. And the issue of ambient listening concerns, that devices like Alexa aren't just waiting for commands, but are, listening in more broadly. Even seemingly harmless devices like baby monitors have apparently been hacked, preying on parental vulnerability.
It all points to the very real risk of sudden system shutdowns and severe business disruption if organizations aren't prepared, doesn't it?
Right. If you don't have robust disaster recovery mechanisms in place, you're incredibly vulnerable. The sources also pointed out, interestingly, that technology contributes to a widening wealth gap. You have the big four tech companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, wielding enormous global influence. Their, effectively, GDPs are larger than many countries.
The concentration of power is certainly significant, and all this tech advancement just amplifies the risks around cybersecurity.
Exponentially. The potential for financial loss, reputational damage, regulatory penalties from cyber incidents, it's growing so rapidly. The challenge for boards is finding the right level of involvement. How do you exercise oversight without getting totally bogged down in the operational weeds?
So what questions should boards be asking then? What's their role?
They need to be asking about adequate safeguards, especially given how reliant organizations are now on technology. Do they have a cyber-specific crisis management playbook? What is the plan if servers get shut down and a huge ransom is demanded, say, $10 million? What happens if all the data is lost?
Framing attacks as unfortunate rather than unlikely seems like a key mindset shift to get that perspective right.
It really is. Organizations need to build capacity and resilience, but the reality is attackers are constantly evolving. They're often one step ahead. It's an ongoing battle. Boards also need to grasp the potential value destruction from downtime. The source noted even, like, 2% downtime can cost a telecoms company dearly. It's serious money.
So ensuring the organization is prepared isn't just about ticking a compliance box, it's about protecting the core business itself.
Absolutely. Boards need to demand that necessary tests are run, that capabilities are assessed. Using ethical hackers, for example, to test your own systems, the source mentioned the U.S. Defense Department hires hackers for this exact purpose, is a crucial step. Organizations must test their disaster recovery plans through realistic simulations, not just have a plan on paper.
And this isn't just abstract stuff for IT departments, is it? It impacts all of us. The source mentioned a comment about the Computer Misuse Bill, legislation that directly addresses cybercrime. It reminds us how these risks affect the services and infrastructure we rely on every single day.
It touches our lives directly, no question.
Okay, shifting slightly but related. What other major external forces or maybe internal dynamics are adding pressure and keeping boards on edge?
Well, beyond technology and cyber risk, the discussion really highlighted the significant impact of global disruptions. Things like the post-COVID landscape, the Russia-Ukraine war. They create this macroeconomic and geopolitical volatility that directly challenges the boardroom.
It feels like even if a CEO reports stable numbers internally, the ground outside is constantly shifting underneath them.
Exactly. The source pointed to effects like inflation levels not seen over 10% since, I think it was July 2012, volatile exchange rates, high interest rates. They cited the one-year Treasury bill at 14%. These forces drastically impact costs, budgets, financial results, the stock market, and even the well-being of staff facing high living costs, fuel costs, etc.
And supply chain disruption were mentioned too, right? The difficulty finding goods ordered months ago because of bottlenecks somewhere else in the world, like China.
Yeah. It shifts the focus in the boardroom sometimes from that long-term strategic planning to more immediate tactical survival. It demands agility, finding new ways to operate, leveraging technology, outsourcing partnerships, just to navigate the current environment.
But the source also noted a silver lining within these disruptions, is that right?
Yes, this idea that risk, and the Chinese word for risk apparently includes the character for opportunity, also creates new possibilities. Examples like Zoom's share price surging during COVID, or the opportunities created by those high T-bill rates. They show that agile, diversified boards are potentially better positioned to identify and capitalize on these moments amidst the volatility.
Okay. Moving inside the organization now. Stakeholder management was highlighted as increasingly complex.
Massively so. The source really emphasized that the shareholder is no longer the sole dominant figure, not the only king in the castle anymore. The spectrum of stakeholders, employees, customers, regulators, the community, the environment, and so on has expanded significantly. Managing these relationships is now absolutely crucial.
So how do boards even navigate that complexity?
Well, they need to systematically map out who their stakeholders are, assess their potential impact, and then develop specific strategies for managing those concerns. And with information spreading instantly, the example of a tweeting president changing markets in a moment was cited. Effective stakeholder management can literally make or break an organization today.
The complexity was vividly illustrated with that pipeline example mentioned in the source.
Yes, that issue involved, what was it? An EU motion, the government, civil society groups, geopolitical factors, political spin, technical views. It's far more than just two parties hashing it out. It's a multi-stakeholder challenge that requires navigating these diverse, sometimes conflicting interests. Really complex web.
And speaking of conflicting interests, what about the challenge of dealing with an over-dominant shareholder? The source noted there's no easy template for this, which sounds about right.
No, it requires maturity and a genuine willingness from both sides of the board and the shareholder. The need for clear rules of engagement was emphasized. They used a metaphor about needing courage to speak up, even if it feels uncomfortable, like covering yourself with someone who has a hunchback. You just have to do it. Governance principles require treating all shareholders equally, even if one holds a majority stake. Influence, or soft power, becomes really key.
And directors have a fundamental duty to the organization itself, right? Which can sometimes put them in a difficult position with a dominant shareholder.
Exactly. Directors must act in the best interest of the organization. That can sometimes mean putting personal interests or even the interests of that dominant shareholder aside if they conflict with the organization's overall well-being. This is particularly challenging when shareholder representatives form a majority on the board itself.
Right, because they're agents of the shareholder.
But they must still uphold their stewardship duty to the organization as a whole. The source stressed the importance of confronting these difficult situations early. Don't let them fester. Training can help create a safe space for these potentially awkward but necessary conversations.
And importantly,
Importantly, directors are not hostages. The source noted they can choose to leave if the situation compromises their integrity, especially considering they aren't always substantially compensated for the risks they bear.
internal conflicts were also mentioned. Conflicts between the board and management generally, or specifically between the chair and CEO, sometimes involving a rock star CEO whose performance might mask other issues.
Yeah, willingness and maturity are vital here too. Conflict can arise from personal agendas or even sometimes malice. Addressing the rockstar CEO is tricky because their success might blind people to unethical behavior happening below the surface.
So what's needed?
It requires bold leadership from the chair or the board. Sometimes that might even involve making the difficult decision to remove the CEO to fundamentally change the organizational culture. That power dynamic between the chair and CEO is common, it's complex, but it needs strong, serious chairpersons to navigate effectively.
The role of the company secretary in all this was highlighted as crucial, but maybe often underestimated.
Absolutely. Some people might just see them as minute takers, right?
Yeah.
But they are a critical governance figure. They act as the vital link between senior management and the board.
How so?
Well, they often know the board members, their personalities, their dynamics really well. They can provide essential advice on things like the best timing to bring a sensitive item to the board agenda. It requires very high emotional intelligence. The discussion even included a suggestion to involve them more directly in future discussions, which really underscores their value.
And finally, on internal dynamics, the sources touched on something a bit sensitive. Informal communication. Board members bypassing senior management to talk directly with junior or middle staff.
Yes, this was generally seen as problematic, bordering on indiscipline, actually. It's often a signal that something is broken in the governance system itself, perhaps a lack of trust or a poor relationship between the executive team and the board.
So the advice is?
Fix the system. Investigate why it's happening, rather than reinforcing that bypassing behavior. While structured interactions with staff below the executive level, sometimes called XCOM -1 or 2, can be valuable, going around the formal hierarchy is usually counterproductive and undermines the exec team.
Okay, let's shift gears one last time maybe to how boards are actually structured and the personal demands placed on those serving on them. The discussion touched on committees and making space for new members.
Yes, there was talk about the rise of specific board committees, particularly ICT or digital committees. Examples were given like Stanbic, a large company in the region, having a combined risk-it committee, and EABL, another major company, having one too. This is becoming almost imperative, especially in sectors like banking where digital reliance is absolutely core.
But for businesses where tech isn't the primary focus, say cosmetics or farming, they might rely more on independent advisors with specific tech expertise rather than a full committee.
That's a good point. It's about finding the right structure for the specific business context. There's also a balance needed, isn't there? Between committees focused on oversight, like a risk committee managing tech risks, and those focused on identifying growth opportunities driven by technology, maybe a growth or strategy committee.
Advisory boards were also presented as a potentially useful model in some situations.
Yeah, they were seen as a good model, particularly for startups, where maybe executive directors make up most of the main board. Advisory boards can provide that crucial external perspective and expertise without the full governance structure, the formalities of a statutory board.
And established boards can use them too.
Sure, established boards can also use them to fill specific skill gaps, perhaps needing an investment advisor for a period. They're generally less formal. The WellSpan story was mentioned as an example of using a council of independent advisors effectively during a crisis, and some jurisdictions even have formal structures involving advisory councils or even two separate boards.
What about the concept of career board members? And, relatedly, ensuring there's space for younger, perhaps still learning, members to come through.
The term career board members does exist, yeah. For individuals who primarily focus their professional life on board service, some governance structures try to address this through things like tenure limits to encourage turnover.
But are younger people getting opportunities?
The source highlighted that younger people are increasingly joining boards. They pointed to examples of CEOs in their 30s already serving on boards. Boards today seem to be looking more for substance and relevant skills, less so just age or gender alone as prerequisites.
So opportunities are opening up for those earlier in their careers.
Yes. Some organizations are even creating specific initiatives like Horizon Boards. These are spaces for young, non-executive managers within the company to gain board exposure and contribute their perspectives. And again, mentoring is absolutely key here. Seeking out mentors, sharing your aspirations. They can often help identify spaces for learning and development, maybe observing a board meeting, things like that.
Finally, the discussion touched on a critical but perhaps less often discussed aspect: self-care for board members. Given the demands we've talked about, it sounds pretty essential for sustainability.
It was a key point, absolutely. Acknowledging the incredibly demanding schedules, juggling CEO roles, multiple board commitments, attending various events, often in a single day, the need to actively care for both the brain and the body was stressed.
How do they suggest doing that? What does that look like in practice?
Well, for brain care, they mention continuous learning, reading widely, researching topics relevant to the boards, consulting advisors, even doing things like puzzles to keep the mind sharp and agile.
Okay. And for body care?
Pretty much what you'd expect. Exercise. Sweating, running off stress, taking your mind completely off the board issues sometimes to gain clarity later. Sometimes it's simply about mentally packing away those complex issues for a while, letting your subconscious work on them.
And perhaps needing some help to actually stick to those plans. It's easy to let self-care slide when you're busy.
Yes, the importance of accountability groups was mentioned. Having people you trust, maybe peers, maybe mentors, to help you stay committed to your self-care goals.
Yeah.
Because it is easy to let it slip.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That was quite the deep dive, wasn't it? We really journeyed from those individual, sometimes unexpected paths people take to reach the boardroom. We explored how boards themselves are transforming, from perhaps places of privilege to spaces demanding high performance and real diversity. We delved into the intense external challenges from technology, cyber threats, global economics, navigated the complexities of stakeholder management and internal dynamics, looked at board structures, committees, opportunities, and even touched on that essential personal aspect of integrity, continuous learning, and self-care.
It really paints a comprehensive picture, doesn't it, of the multifaceted world of the modern boardroom and all the forces shaping it. And to synthesize what's truly keeping boards on the edge, really trying to directly address that core question the source discussion explored.
Yeah, what were the key takeaways?
Well, one panelist really pointed to the relentless pace of technology and the associated cyber risks, seeing them as almost existential threats if not managed properly.
Okay, tech and cyber. What else?
Another highlighted the growing complexity of stakeholder management, that whole universe of people and groups boards need to consider now, and also the broader volatile macroeconomic environment and geopolitics as huge disruptors, things largely outside their direct control, but with massive impact.
Makes sense. And the third?
And a third specifically called out the global war for talent. The critical need for the right skills, the right people to actually leverage all this complex technology for human benefit. And, interestingly, the potential for increasing protectionism around the world to disrupt global systems, supply chains, labor flows.
Those are certainly powerful, interconnected forces creating significant pressure. But as the source also noted, while they create risk, and significant risk at that, for those boards that are agile, adaptable, and genuinely looking ahead, they also create significant opportunities, right?
Absolutely. It's a high-stakes environment, no doubt about it, but one that's also ripe with potential for those prepared and willing to navigate it effectively.
So, for you, our listener, considering all these profound shifts and pressures on the boardroom, the changing expectations, the tech risks, the economic volatility, the complex relationships, what does this all mean for your organization, maybe your career path, and how you might need to adapt? What is the single most important area you feel you need to understand better or prepare for next to ensure you're not just reacting to being on the edge, but actually positioned to thrive in this changing world?
Definitely something to reflect on as you process all these insights.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the changing boardroom. Keep exploring, keep learning.
Until next time.